This is True News. I'm Doc Burkhart, and this has been an amazing week of global coverage here on True News. Even as we speak, our two teams are en route back home here to Vero Beach, Florida. Edward Zoll and Carrie Kinsey are making their way from their intense week of coverage of President Trump's summit with Kim Jong-un in Hanoi, Vietnam. I'm sure they will have a lot to talk about next week here on the Godcast regarding their trip, and we will be looking forward to it. True News producer Matt Scow, Flowing Stream's Chief Information Officer Paul Benson, and True News founder and host Rick Wiles are also on their way back from Barcelona, Spain, from this year's Mobile World Congress. Now, if you didn't get a chance to watch it yet, I would implore you to go to the TrueNews.com website and check out Rick's update on his week at this technology event. What did we see this week? Well, let's see. We saw the microchipping of humans live, holograms that you can touch, CEOs saying that they are building the brain and nervous system for a brand new world, and driverless tractor trailers on the interstate highways of America today, right now. It's just another week here at True News. Well, Rick will be back here on Monday to share even more insights of what he learned at this past week at Mobile World Congress, so stay tuned next week for that. Joining us in just a few minutes is a longtime friend of the ministry, Terry Saka, Chief Strategist and Analyst for Cornerstone Asset Metals. We'll be discussing the rapid changes that are taking place in investments, the global economy, cryptocurrency, and a whole lot more. But first, I wanted to share with you just how dangerous our world has become. In all our coverage of the Hanoi Summit and Mobile World Congress, there seems to be something stirring in our provocative relationship with Russia. Now, earlier this week, U.S. Army Secretary Mark Esper, in an interview, said that the U.S. Army estimates that the Russian Army's military capabilities will peak in 2028, closely followed by the Chinese around 2030, giving the United States almost a decade to prepare for those threats. He went on to say, what we're looking at is 2028 and beyond, because we think it's time the Russians will be peaking. The Chinese after in the 2030 time frame. If we're going to fight and win, listen to that, if we're going to fight and win against the Russians and Chinese in the year 2030, 2040, and 2050, I've got to start building the next generation now. That's U.S. Army Secretary Mark Esper saying that. Now, are they telling us that the wars are already on the calendar? Well, then there's this featured article in the New York Times earlier this week as well. Aim, I say, at the city of Washington. Russia revives Cold War playbook. Now, this article made the argument that Russia is, quote, dusting off its mutually assured destruction playbook, unquote, saying the nation is ready to make aggressive moves globally. Well, the article failed to mention how Russia is being constantly provoked by the West. You know, Russia is not sitting idly by waiting for Western powers to draw them into a conflict. In the following clip, Russian TV host Dmitry Kisilov anchored a segment earlier this week during the primetime Russian program Vesti Nedeli. He mentioned 5 targets in the U.S., including the Pentagon, Camp David, closed U.S. forts Fort Ritchie and Fort McClellan, and an unnamed missile facility in Washington State. Now, in this clip, he also showed submarines approaching the coastline, so they were in range of those targets. Mr. Kisilov is famous for saying years ago that Russia could reduce the United States to nuclear dust. All right, so we've got that going on. Now, there's even more as we start looking at things. In this particular segment that you're looking at here on the screen right now, after this was broadcast, supporters of President Putin cheered the message, and in the talk show immediately following the program, one commentator said there was no need to rely on weapons like tanks anymore since the response would be nuclear. Well, just last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin also said in his State of the Nation address, and our American colleagues have tried to gain absolute military supremacy by creating a global missile defense system. They need to give up such illusions. Our response will always be real and effective. Russia will be forced to create and deploy weapons that can only be used in areas where we are directly threatened from, but also in areas that contain decision-making centers for the missile systems threatening us. Now, if all that's not disturbing enough, here's the following. On February 19th, which was Defenders of the Fatherland Day in Russia, at St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg, Russia, a choir presented a special musical presentation. Now, the song you're about to hear is called On the Wages of Servicemen and was written by Russian singer Andrei Kozlovsky in 1980. Now, it was performed by the St. Petersburg Concert Choir. Now, I want to share this video segment with you, and it's got the captions and everything with it. And I want you to keep in mind that this was performed in a church and by a church choir. I don't believe that many outlets will be sharing this information. Prepare to be shocked. Here's that clip. Well, the choir received a standing ovation at the conclusion of their performance. Well, joining me today to respond to this heart-pounding information and to update us on how we can prepare financially and spiritually here in these last days is Terry Saka. Terry is an accredited asset management specialist at Cornerstone Asset Metals. Terry established Cornerstone Asset Metals for investors who seek guidance in protecting their hard-earned wealth against the dangers of inflation by investing in tangible assets. He's also a huge fan and friend of the Ministry of True News. Terry, welcome to the Godcast. What's your reaction, what we just watched there?
I'm actually a little bit tingled. I mean, that was mind-blowing.
Yes.
And I almost can see their confidence when it comes to the relationship between China and Russia.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit.
Because they weren't that way in the 90s, remember?
Right. Yeah, they were very much, I wouldn't call them adversaries so much as they were, in competition with each other. That might be a better way to put it.
Right.
But there's been a significant change in that relationship, hasn't there?
tremendous change beyond what you and I were discussing before. And I find that before this even got started, Doc and I just started talking, and he's providing information I hadn't heard, and I was telling him some things that he hadn't heard, and all of a sudden we were like little kids, and we're realizing, wow, there's a bigger picture here. And it's not just the petrodollar.
Right.
It's bigger than that. And I think Russia has been emboldened with the relationship with China militarily.
Now we talked a little bit in preparation for the Godcast today about Russia's new confidence. And part of that new confidence is, I get the sense, Terry, and maybe I'm wrong, I'm not the financial expert as you are, but I think they have the sense now that they really don't have to buy into the Western model anymore, that they are on the verge of being able to come up with their own financial system, their own version of SWIFT, their own cryptocurrencies that are partnered together with nations like China and India, South Africa, Brazil, others. There's a new day dawning, but not just as it relates to financial, but also militarily as well, and you can speak to that too, because really the petrodollar up to this point has been a nuclear-backed dollar, right?
Yes.
Because without the force of the United States to really enforce the petrodollar, it's worthless. Is there a sense, and maybe you can see this as well, Terry, that there's a new military age rising, with all the technology we have seen develop? Russia here lately has been, I'd be very confident in their new weaponry. Mm-hmm. Is that giving them the confidence now to be able to say, we don't need the U.S. anymore?
I think not just the weaponry, but I also believe it's the relationship with China. I mean, okay. we found over the years in the Middle East, they have been orchestrating this takedown. And when it comes to petrodollar, a lot of people are really unaware of what the petrodollar means. They think
explain it for our audience here.
Well, the petrodollar, they believe, is profit for oil. And to some extent, I guess it could be. But the real thing about the petrodollar was in the 70s, the United States made an arrangement with the Saudis. We will protect you militarily. You make every barrel of oil priced in an American dollar. Now, remember, we were coming just off the gold standard. So that gave us the ability to print endless amounts of American currency, gave us dominant power. Everybody needed dollars, so then therefore our bonds became acceptable. Therefore, we control the world.
Right.
And that was the petrodollar relationship. As long as oil, which every nation needed, was priced in an American dollar, we then, of course, had control of the world financially.
Right.
And that's a big difference because most people don't realize that that's the core of petrodollar.
Now, you said that this relationship with Russia and China has been building for years. Can you give me some examples of how you have seen Russia and China make their attacks on the petrodollar? What conflicts or what things are happening in the world that have led up to that?
Well, it's similar to action-reaction, but if you just go starting with Ukraine,
okay.
I know they say Ukraine was really a standard revolution and then Russia comes in and takes Crimea. But that's really not how it played out. Most really understand that this was black ops, from the West that started the Ukrainian. And Crimea, if people do the research back to Catherine the Great, that belongs to Russia.
Yeah, that's their promised land. Well, the birth of Christianity in Russia.
You know what's even crazier than that for promised land? This is kind of creepy, but that's where they have underground in the caves, in the mountains there, their nuclear submarine fleet.
Really? In Crimea?
In Crimea. So what, we think that they're just not going to, they're just going to let us take it? They are not going to allow the West to dominate the region. That was their only warm water port. And that's where their nuclear submarines were out of. So, of course, Russia sees the writing on the wall. We caused the coup in Ukraine to try to destabilize Ukraine for this pipeline deal. Now, this goes into the Clintons. It goes to the United Arab Emirates. It gets deeper. But that was the beginning. And then the whole Syria narrative, we all know is false. I mean, we know what they were really trying to do. They needed Assad out in order to realign that region for pipelines from oil from the east to the west. In Syria, there were a tremendous amount of Chinese troops alongside with Russia, and yet they don't talk about that.
Right.
So that's just the beginning of the undermining. And so what they were doing in undermining the relationship is they're undermining relationships. The Russians are tying into those in the Middle East. The Chinese, as we'll talk about a little later, are directly building relationships with Saudi Arabia. And they've been doing this systematically. So during the Syria conflict, it was Russia, China against the West. Ukraine was Russia, China consulting against the West, and it all revolved around oil.
So is the United States getting in a position where they're going to have to come up with a military answer to an economic crisis that's on the horizon?
They almost have no choice. Part of our, now it could have changed, but part of our nuclear edict was, if someone were to threaten nuclear, of course we respond. But I really believe if the systematic takedown of the dollar goes, we will respond with full force military, because if the dollar dominance goes down, we in the United States are inherently broke. And without the ability to print currency into, endlessness, we would have to use military to stop it, because otherwise they're going to take it over. The narrative, which China has. When you think about it, they have currency hubs in Luxembourg. They're now situated all around the world to start doing their currencies in the yuan.
Sure.
They've now taken over as the world's largest trader as far as exporter. And so they have dominated. They now dominate the shipping lanes. They dominate the rails, the trucking on the Silk Road going from China over to Europe. They are the international trade hub. And so what they were doing is working together to systematically undermine our efforts in the Middle East to orchestrate the relationship, not just with Saudi Arabia, but it started with the United Arab Emirates and that little angle of pipelining that was the Nabucco pipelines and some others that were going up, and they needed Syrian land. And of course, if they could get Assad out, they could put in the extremist Islamists into Syria, control the people, control the region, keep the Russian Chinese at bay, and then control the pipeline channels.
Well, speaking of pipelines, last year we were at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, and we were right there when President Putin made the remark out to Emmanuel Macron. They were speaking about pipelines, they were speaking about natural gas, but they also got on the topic of security for Europe. And President Putin put it out there saying, we can provide security for Europe. And that gave, I still remember Edward and Rick and I were sitting there, we were just like going, whoa, did the President Putin just offer to protect Europe? And it really got us thinking about, why would he put that offer out there? Well, Europe depends on Russian natural gas, doesn't it?
Well, Germany, about 40%. Germany being the economic engine of Europe, 40% of their energy needs comes from Russia. So they absolutely must have that relationship. One, countries like Finland and some of the others, almost 100% dependent on Russian energy. So the only little twist that I want to give, some goodness to America, we have a massive gas supply ourselves.
Right.
And we're learning to liquefy it and then ship.
Right.
So can we liquefy and ship to supply enough for European needs to bypass Russia?
Right.
Or is Europe, because Europe is going so radically socialist and totalitarianly, controlled by the technocrats in Belgium, will they end up going to the east?
Well, that's one thing I wanted to ask you about, because are we going to see a new age of shifting alliances here? I mean, we think that we've got a lock on NATO, but we haven't had a really cold winter yet. And so at that point, sometime in the future, maybe even this year or next winter, but the coldness is coming at some point here in the very near future. Will that cause a shift in alliances in Europe? One factor being the socialism that you talked about, but also just the desperation to be able to say, we need to stay warm and we need affordable energy coming into Germany, into, like you said, Finland, into France, and controlling all the pipelines going all the way from Syria through Turkey, through the Ukraine, and then to Europe. I mean, the Russians have that.
They control it. Yes.
That's their energy highway.
Yes.
So when you couple the energy highway with the new Silk Road that China is building throughout the world, I mean, you have a 1-2 punch, don't you?
Beyond 1-2 punch, we've been set up. And it's unfortunate, but I don't know what the military was doing at the time, maybe focusing on jihads. But under the administration of Obama, we have walked the Chinese and Russians into one another. Now, they were doing an energy deal, for instance, a big $400+ billion energy deal with each other. And they were doing it in the U.S. dollar originally. Now, that's the petrodollar concept that you have to do. All energy has to use dollars. Well, the problem is we go, why, I don't really know. We start hammering sanctions on Russia. Now Russia and Chinese decide, well, we're no longer going to use the dollar. We now do our energy deals in our own currency. That was a huge violation of the petrodollar. And that was a direct undermine. And that's while we're in the middle of the war in Iraq, in Syria. So we pushed them into it. So I think you guys have some interesting angles, because why were we pushing Russia into that relationship?
Right.
Why did we push it together? If you look at NATO bases around Russia, it looks like a catcher's mitt.
Yes.
And if you're Russia, are you really seriously going to, sit back and not get serious about it? But the fact that they are undermining the petrodollar in the Middle East slowly and systematically, it's to take down that dollar dominance. We forced them to do this big energy deal in their own currencies. Why would we have done that? And that was under President Obama's watch.
Right. You talked about the ships coming from the U.S. with the liquefied natural gas and being able to come to Europe and other places around the world to deliver energy. Well, if that's assuming that the ships can dock somewhere into ports, right? But with the development of the Chinese Silk Road globally, we see them in development of new ports around the world, buying ports like Haifa off in Israel, and also other ports around the world. Right, the Greek port.
That's a big one.
But what's unique about the port acquisition around the world, and this would be an evil dock strategy here, is front-loading the financing for the development of a lot of these ports for these, economically strapped nations. And then once the ports are functioning, they're not able to make payments and keep up with the ports. And then what happens? The Chinese shell companies come along and they take over the ports, the management of the ports, the direction of the ports. And so if you're Chinese and you're in competition with the United States, and you're in partnership with Russia, why would you let a U.S. ship full of liquefied natural gas dock in your port?
Now, see, hence the problem. And so the relationships we're seeing, new alliances, we're seeing that many are going towards the east.
Yes.
And the best example would be the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank,
right.
The New Development Bank. Even our allies were becoming subscribers into that system, which is really a mirror of our IMF and a mirror of our World Bank. So they were building a mirror system, and then Russia actually has their own SWIFT.
Yes.
And for those that don't know the SWIFT is the interbanking money transfer system from country to country to do business. So if they wanted to do a purchase, they would first go to the SWIFT system to do the transfers, do the exchanges on the currencies. Well, if you didn't have SWIFT, or if you were kicked out of SWIFT, you couldn't do international business. Now, the worst part, Doc, is an example of that. A French bank, and I don't know the name of it, I forget off the top of my head, but a French bank was doing business with Iran. Mm-hmm. We didn't like it because they were bypassing, so we said, we are going to cut you off of SWIFT. Yes. And then what did we do 2 months later? We released the sanctions and people could do business with Iran when President Obama did that amazing deal with Iran, giving them all the money. So there was something going on deeper. And that's at the core of all of this. It's the control of the energy supply.
Speaking of that, there are new alliances being formed, it seems like almost on a weekly basis, and they're constantly shifting back and forth. But you were sharing with me before we started the Godcast today about a recent development you came across between China and Saudi Arabia. And I'm just going to let you explain this because I want to really give the shock value to our audience that are watching and listening today. What's happening between China and Saudi Arabia today?
Well, Americans, for the most part, believe that Saudi Arabia is there because they give us the oil. So Americans say, well, they're there for the oil and that's what it is. But it's a lot more to just the oil. But it's the petrodollar. We know that. Mm-hmm. We needed the Saudis to price oil in dollars. And so controlling the oil controlled the world finance. It controlled everything. At that point, we could dictate to countries. We were basically in control. Well, now the Chinese have come in. And they've been doing this systematically, not just the Middle East, by the way. It's South America. It's all over. You've been talking about some of the other hubs they're buying in and shipping.
Right.
They just did a $10 billion refinery deal. Now, okay, it's an oil refinery deal. It's $10 billion. It's a big deal. But it's bigger than that.
Okay.
Bin Salman then says, we will now mandate all Saudi Arabian schools, catch this, all Saudi Arabian schools to speak Mandarin, and the Chinese are now convincing the Saudis to engage in currency transactions in the yuan.
Yes.
Now think about it. We want you to speak Mandarin and do currency in the yuan. What do you think is going to happen to the petrodollar?
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. We can't have it bye-bye. I think without the dollar, where then is our persuasion? Besides the military, of course.
I really want our audience to really hear what you just said here, that the Saudis now are mandating every child in a Saudi Arabian school to learn Mandarin. Now, this is confirmed, right?
Yeah.
So that alone should tell you where the future is. I mean, when I was living and working in South Korea, it was mandated that everyone speak English. And the reason why is because that's what the language of business was in, internationally, was English.
Right.
So when a nation like Saudi Arabia comes out and says, we will now teach every child, and so they're preparing for the next generation, teach every child Mandarin, what does that tell you about where the future is for business for Saudi Arabia?
Exactly. And, if people want to really get an understanding of the petrodollar relationship, once the Saudis and the United States came together in this partnership, we now defend you militarily, you price all oil in U.S. dollars, hence the American dream was born.
Right.
They could print the money. We had all this excess money. We started doing infrastructure. We started military. We started doing welfare. Well, now that changes, and it goes into the yuan, and now it goes to the Chinese. All of that relationship changes. Now, where is Saudi going?
Right.
And most Americans are like, why are we friends with the Saudis? Well, it was mainly because it controlled all of the oil in OPEC.
But now we are, quote, oil exporting nation now, right?
Yes, that's huge for us. Now, what we do have, we have our own oil production. We have our own gas. We're pretty wealthy in that respect. But the problem is we have, 22 trillion in the official book that people see as a national debt.
Right.
But they don't tell you about the 100 trillion in the backdrop that's unfunded liabilities.
Right.
They don't tell you about all the other shadow financing issues.
The derivatives.
Derivatives. And by the way, that's the only thing that keeps the precious metals down as they are derivatives. The number of derivatives are astronomical against gold and silver.
And for our audience that may not understand what a derivative is, can you, in a nutshell, explain it?
A derivative basically is an investment product that basically is paper. So a derivative is supposed to be an investment that is backed up by some form of asset of some kind.
Right.
Best derivative to understand is in the housing market. We all know in 2008 that the housing market collapses, right? It's because they had derivatives, meaning they took good mortgages and they took bad mortgages, they put it in a box and they said, this is investment A, derivative A. We sell it to the stock market. So derivatives are really a concoction of paper investments, supposedly to have an asset backed.
So it's a bet that something good's going to happen in the future.
A bet and an ability to manipulate.
Ah, okay.
Because in the case of gold and silver, for instance, silver has a derivative manipulation of somewhere to 600 ounces to 1, meaning there's about 600 ounces sold on paper for every 1 real physical ounce in the vault for delivery.
It doesn't seem like that should be legal.
The problem is they're working on behalf of the U.S. government in psychology.
Right.
Because if the world sees gold and silver prices go gold beyond 2,000, silver beyond 50, it would trigger a psychological event that the U.S. dollar no longer is the world dominant currency.
Right.
And so they've been manipulating it to keep everyone thinking the dollar still is the world standard bearer, but it's not. Unfortunately, our debt load is so extreme, and you go around America, all you have to do is look at the infrastructure.
Right.
Look at what's going on in most of American small towns to know we're on more of a decline to a degree, not an increase like you're seeing in these new relationships.
So that $22 trillion, that official debt, $100 trillion of unfunded liabilities, the stacks of derivatives that are there, what happens on that day when the bets are called?
Well, we have that conversation a lot. And the thing that concerns me probably the most, we've been talking about this, there's something called exchange for physical. So just in the gold and silver derivative area. An exchange for physical means in the derivative futures market where if you want to, it's 5,000 ounces for silver. So if you want the actual physical, you say, okay, I want the physical. The United States and the COMEX can't fulfill the physical delivery. So they're shipping these EFPs over to London because we don't have it. So if everyone decided I want the physical, which by the way they're doing it, and we can't really find out exactly who, but if I have to guess, those that are standing for the physical, putting the pressure on the system right now, are very Chinese.
Right.
Using financial little sovereign hubs to do it. It's not exactly Chinese government or Chinese banks. But by doing that, they're taking the physical over to London, and then London's forced to actually deliver the physical. If 10% of these derivatives in the precious metals market actually said, deliver me, it defaults because we don't have it.
If something like that were to happen at some point in the future, what would be the first sign that the collapse is about ready to take place? Would we see some very strange things happening in Europe first and then the U.S., or what would be some of the warning signs that it's coming?
You already know, and that's why I just love talking with you. Military.
Yes.
We're going to start some type of war, some skirmish for distraction purposes before that collapse were to take place.
Well, and we started out the program today talking about how the United States is preparing for a window of war, it looks like, somewhere in the late 2020s, early 2030s with Russia and China.
I'm fascinated by that because, they have sophisticated weaponry, the Russians.
Yes.
Who's kidding who? Those submarines, those torpedoes, I mean, it's impossible thought to think we're going to war with them. But yet, if we don't stop, which we can't, we've already let the cat out, the Pandora box is open. Mm-hmm. We can no longer control the narrative, the dominance of the dollar superiority to the world. The yuan's moving in, the Chinese are preparing, the Russians finally buddied up with the Chinese. So that's why I think they're feeling pretty confident. I really believe that in order to stop the financial carnage or the exposure of the United States default status on all these financial instruments, and there's so many of them that are fake. And when I say, I hate that word now, but meaning they're just not real. They're not backed up by real assets. It's not a real investment. If the world realized to the level of fraud that is in our financial system, we're back to square one. We're going right back to the pre-Depression time when we were broke. Mm-hmm. You remember, we were broke in the Great Depression.
Yes.
It wasn't ironically until World War II began. 70% of the world's gold found its way back to the U.S. because Europe was shipping over their gold and we were giving them supplies for the war.
Right.
If we don't contain that narrative, we will financially be in serious disarray. And we're already seeing it in the United States. So if we think we have inflationary issues now, when we have locals, municipalities, states, cities like Chicago and others we were talking about that are way overspent, pensioners that are in jeopardy. If so many of these cities in the United States are on the verge of default now.
Yes.
Pension
when
systems,
things are supposedly good.
Yes, after a period of 10 years of expansion. Mind you, we're in an economic expansion largest in U.S. history. And yet, does it seem like it to any of us? I shouldn't be laughing, but I'm just stunned at the fraud. But then I think fraud, this is my country. I'm ex-Army. I'm kind of digging, the flag. I love our country. But then I'm realizing we're sticking up for us.
Right.
If we don't do this, we lose our American dream. And so this is a lot bigger than people realize. And I have to think it'll probably be some form of military as an indicator, because Europe is already on the edge. There's serious issues in Europe, way beyond just the financial.
Right.
United States, we know, I think the president's been doing phenomenal on some of the policies. I think, he's got both sides of the deep state, both political parties against him, and yet he's pulling out victory after victory.
Right.
He knows, if I have to guess, Doc, and I've been saying this often, and I hope I'm right on this. President Trump is doing everything he can to get the economy in the right place.
Right.
Unfortunately, he's too late. It's already been put in place.
That's the real problem.
But here's the good news, hopefully. He's so smart. If we can get the deep state off of him and get these corrupt, criminal cabal on both sides off of him, he can prepare a foundation for the American people to come back from what is coming. And that gives me hope.
Well, but what gives me pause, though, in that whole conversation there, Terry, is that I also know that there are people whispering in his ear saying, there's a quick fix for this. There are quick fixes like Syria, Ukraine, Venezuela. Poke the bear in the eye somewhere in Eastern Europe, and let's get the war machine going. Let's get let's start building things. Let's start getting the military operating again at high capacity. Those are the things that really give me pause in this whole thing, Terry. Do they, as an investor looking forward, your job as a forecaster, you're looking at the future and seeing where assets are going to be heading in the future. As a forecaster in asset management, do you look at these things that are happening, these different regional conflicts like the South China Sea and Venezuela? Venezuela, it's popping up. We're pulling troops out of Afghanistan and Syria. We've got to have these guys go somewhere, and I guess it's going to be Venezuela. Do these come on your radar as well as far as considering where we're going here over the next 5 or 10 years?
They no doubt they do. What I try to do is I use micro and macro analysis. So I take these micro skirmishes, these micro events, and then I apply them into the bigger picture of what they're really trying to do. And I find, being in the military, I was in nuclear stuff, and so I got to talk to certain people at high levels, and I realized we have a tendency to want people to look over here when this is really what's going on. So a lot of what we do is deception. It's like a house of cards, kind of a trick.
Yes.
That concerns me because these microaggressions that are around the world are merely plotting the pawns for the bigger picture. So absolutely is a financial side of it. But then on the macro, most people are just, in America especially, they're just not wanting to go past the next quarterly ROI on their reports. Mm-hmm. They don't want to go beyond the 401k concept. They're too busy trying to get by with their jobs and the children and whatever else is
I would even go on a weekly basis.
Well, you know what? They do. I mean, to the point, some people are every day looking at accounts.
Right.
So the problem is they're looking at paper assets, titleless assets. And we could get deep in a rabbit hole if you heard stories on the titles and who controls the titles and where they're stored and what. I'm concerned, Americans, if this narrative breaks out and we're not prepared and we're all in paper as assets, so many people are going to lose tremendous amounts of wealth because they don't have a tangible title to their asset, and that's very concerning. So I look at those pictures and I say, okay, you could maybe allocate X amount to paper here, but how much in physical, tangible, something that if it hits that fan, are you prepared to say I'm safe with? I get peace at night.
The world economy really is based on deception, isn't it?
Yeah, actually, unfortunately, yes. Yeah.
But there's another economy that's in operation, isn't there? There's God's economy.
Amen, brother. That's really, what I'm talking about.
And really, it's more than a spiritual economy. We're talking about God has laws in place, and these are laws that have been in place for thousands of years. We read about them in the Old Testament. Principles that are there in the scriptures that can tell, it told ancient Israel, and it told early Christians, and it tells believers today that you don't have to operate in the world system. That the world system is a giant shell game, moving assets from one to another, or fractional reserve lending. You borrow a little bit and it gets you a lot, and there's a deception that's with that. Yes. But there's no deception in God's economy, is there?
No.
Tell us some of the basics of God's economy. What was God's plan for being able to, we have to, be able to trade and be able to purchase items, be able to purchase items to generate food or generate an income, provide for our family. So how does this work? What is God's economy right now? What's His plan for us as believers? And how does that fit into a wicked world economy?
Well, what's interesting, there's really two components that I like to look at from God's economy side. Number one, you look at it that in the Bible says Lucifer is God of the world, or is in charge of the world, right? Mm-hmm. Well, the world defined in the Bible is the systems of. So it'd be your government, your currencies, your music, those elements of the system.
The kingdoms of the world.
Yes. Well, God said, I had given you dominion over things of the earth. And now the earth would be your food, your oil, your gas, your gold, your silver. If Christians had always maintained that belief, and we controlled all the earth's natural resources, of course we run the world, right? Mm-hmm. Second component, I love this scripture. Think of Job. He's the oldest writing in the Bible, right? Job 27 says, now I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but Job 27 says, the wicked will pile up silver like dust. And then it goes on, raiment and others, but then it says, in the end, it will be distributed to the innocent. I think of the Christians. But here's what I find interesting there. The wicked will pile up silver like dust. Silver was money. Haggai 2:8, the gold is mine, silver is mine. The wicked hoard the money. Well, the wicked, being in Lucifer, went into the Lucifer system, which is currency, these paper dollar notes.
Right.
Wicked no longer really hoards God's money, which is silver. They're hoarding paper.
Right.
So when that
promise
paper
on the silver.
Yes. When that paper system collapses, those holding the physical silver, God's money, exponentially have a wealth transfer. And I believe Job is referencing that in the wicked will pile up silver like dust, but in the end it will be distributed to the innocent, because they got away from real money in God's world, went into this fake currency world. And when that currency system collapses and resets, as many are talking, those holding the tangible assets like silver exponentially increase wealth. That could be the transfer from the wicked to the innocent that I find fascinating. Now, I know people can debate the scripture, but I love that because it does set a precedence of how we focus on what was money.
Right.
When you think the dollar, when it was created back in 1913, supposedly, right? The new one, it is now worth 3 cents on the dollar for buying power. We've literally diluted our ability to buy, and yet silver's maintained it since then. So since they separated, silver's up close to almost 1,600%. And the paper dollar yet is buying you 3 cents on the dollar.
Right.
So what really is money? Money is a storage of value over time. Paper dollars lose value over time.
I think back, I just kind of imagine a scenario back in Abraham's day. Say Abraham is out there trading with local tribesmen in the area, and some tribesman comes up and says, Father Abraham, we'd like to trade with you and everything. He said, okay, we'd like some of those sheep that you got over here. He was wealthy, the Bible says. Abraham was very wealthy. And imagine someone would say to him, Abraham, we would like to give you this piece of paper for those sheep over there. Well, Abraham would be looking at it and going, what am I going to do with this?
Right.
I can't do anything with a piece of paper. I can't eat it. The only thing I can do with it is burn it. That's the only thing. It's create fire with it.
Yes.
Right? So if we think in biblical terms to those days where there was an equal exchange of assets or labor for assets in that realm. But today and really the paper that we use that we're trading in it doesn't even represent hard assets either, does it? It represents
technically it's cotton a little bit, right? But
right.
I mean, yeah, I know what you mean. No.
But it represents debt.
Debt.
That's right. The paper that you carry around in your wallet.
Note.
Yes.
Note meaning debt instrument, meaning you owe somebody.
Yes.
That's very dangerous. And then and going back to the derivative question, it has been a massive psych-op on the American people to get them to understand that, or get them to try to believe that this paper dollar actually has the value, and gold and silver is archaic, it doesn't mean anything. But ironically, they paint still the quarters and the coins look like gold and silver, even though they're plastic tokens pretty much, right? It is all about psychology, Doc.
Right.
They want the American people to believe their only wealth and value is in the paper system they control, not intangible assets you control. Think about that.
Right.
If you're in assets like gold and silver, it's in private vaults, depositories, or your basement or your backyard. Sell it off at any time you want to. You could do it in your IRAs, we have the ability, but it's in your control.
Right.
Why? So the psych-op is to get Americans to give up control, C-E-D-E control. And I say that for a reason. If we ever have time, I'll explain that, because that's who controls all the titles,
Right.
Seed Corporation. That is a psychological thing. And so the derivatives are designed to keep the prices low while we're dealing with this, to keep Americans from diverting away from the paper world into tangible assets.
I want to talk to you here in just a few moments about a plan that believers now, people watching and listening to this Godcast today, can put into place now, that they can start making that shift, first mentally and then actually in the real world make that shift. But I want to ask you one more thing. This week when Rick was at Mobile World Congress, it was on Monday earlier this week, live on stage, I don't know if you had the opportunity to see this or not, but live on stage there at Mobile World Congress. Remember, this is a telecom summit, right?
Right.
on stage, they were actually microchipping people live on stage. And not only did they microchip people live on stage, as soon as they were microchipped, they were able to transfer funds from their hand to a mobile device or even hand to hand. Now, I suppose there'd be people out there that say, I would never take the mark, I'd never do anything like that. I'd like to get your thoughts on that here before we start talking about what the next step is for believers.
Unfortunately, Doc, I am definitely a core believer. And I don't know if it's just because I love the Word, I love God, and I just, once you're so deep in the Word, your eyes open up, you see things differently, you hear things differently, which is the truth, right? Truth sets you free.
Right.
That chip is the one world control mechanism, absolutely in my mind. And then because they could turn you off, think of credit cards.
Yes.
Right? You're out at dinner, they turn it off because they thought it was fraud.
Right.
Right. Well, if you have a chip, everything's electronic, you're in compliant to the Chinese credit systems. We talked at the CES.
Yes.
That's very concerning because if we Americans, especially biblically, if we're not protected in God's money or our tangible assets, doesn't always have to be gold and silver per se, land, but it's not as liquid, but something physical, tangible. If we're all in paper and we go that digital, we lose all sovereignty and the ability to even continue because they can then dictate to us if we're hungry, if we're poor, we don't have any ability or access to our wealth, you do what they say.
And in many ways, isn't that the idea of a digital currency, a global digital currency, isn't that even more manipulative than the fiat system that we have now?
Oh, incredibly, because the fiat system they can't stand. Now, they fractionalized it, and if you go through history and study monetary policy, there's always this expansion, contraction, printing money, it fails. Every fiat currency has gone to zero all throughout history. Problem with fiat currency, they don't know what you do. I was talking to somebody the other day about Uber, and I said, one thing about Uber I don't like is they map out your ride. You have a full log of your ride. Not that I'm hiding anything, it's not the point, but they map out where you go, who you see, what you do. Taxis, on the other hand, currency fiat.
Right.
Taxis, you jump in, they don't know who you are, you give them the money, you leave, they don't know who you are. Fiat is a problem for them in the world because they can't control you, where in the digital side, they immediately know where you are through metadata, who you're talking to, what you're doing, and if they politically don't like you, and who's kidding who under President Obama, what they did in spying on Americans is astounding, they will shut you off. Now, most people say, I don't have anything to worry about. Really? How do you know? How do you know it's not your thoughts, not your looks? How do you know it's not your association?
Yes.
What if you happen to have a good God friend, but yet the government says it's not the good God friend?
Right.
You shut off. And that should be incredibly concerning. So fiat must go away in order to have a global control grid. And we all believe that that's probably where it's going, of course, a technocratic, global control world order.
Right.
If it's digital, the who, what, where, when, why, and how is absolutely 100% in their control.
Yes.
And if they don't like you, your switch is turned off until you go to re-education camp, just like the Chinese are doing right now.
Yes, they're doing it now.
People don't realize they're doing it right. Chinese right now are doing it to their people that are not compliant.
They've got 2 million people in re-education camps now.
Yes.
These aren't summer camps, folks. They're not having, pool parties and everything. They're being, quote, re-educated, unquote.
And what does re-educated mean? Go along with our narrative, and it's obviously all anti-God, anti-Christ. So don't have that. Now, you can have any other deity almost except Christ, which tells you obviously we're the real one.
Right.
That's very concerning. Now, I don't know if it's in our timeline, I don't know if we're going to see it, but I'll bet we're close. It seems like we're closer than not. It's accelerating rapidly. And the problem is, we don't know. We're in the largest expansion in U.S. history. Globally, we're in this big expansion. We expanded, 200 trillion in debt since 2008.
Right.
About 15 trillion in new currencies. We need that kind of reckoning. And that pause you're talking about could be the military one.
Right. And if globally we're in debt, where do we go to pay off that debt? Mars? I mean, come on.
Well, you have to eliminate the debt. And when you think of war has a tendency to wipe out debt for one, and then
And debt holders.
Yes.
So
all of a sudden they recompromise that debt down. And that's why I believe Trump, and I know some people say, well, Trump, he's spending more money than any Democrat would. GOP should be ashamed. I'm like, none of you understand any of it, because Trump knows we're getting to a tail end of things to some extent. I think he's doing that because he knows there's going to be a reset to some extent, and it doesn't even matter what we spend right now.
Right.
There is no such thing as debt anymore. Debt management, it's just kind of silly.
Terry, I want to talk to you here now about what can just ordinary folks do. They're watching this going, wow, global economics and oil and petrodollars, that doesn't impact me. What can I do individually in order to, I want to get out of this world economy.
Yeah, I understand.
I want to get into God's economy. I want to get into what His plan is for my life financially. What's the first step for them?
Well, I mean, I'm a little biased, but let me just do this as an example, because this is a really good example, just to give us in context of what money and what buying power is, what it buys us. But if we take, for instance, God's economy, definitely part of it is silver. It's obviously everything of the land. But silver was the money in the Bible, and it's our constitutional money here, Article 1, Section 8. But think back in the 70s when you had an American dollar and then you had a silver ounce. They were equal. They both bought you about 5 gallons of gas. Gas was probably about 20 cents, right? Then they divorced silver from the paper dollar so they could print a lot after the Vietnam War especially. Now, fast forward to today. That silver is still our constitutional dollar. But and then when you go to buy the gas, silver not only buys the same 5 gallons, it buys almost 8 gallons. So in the course of all this time, silver not only maintained the ability to buy gas, it buys more. Well, the paper dollar today buys you how many gallons? A third, a half?
Yeah, a quarter.
Right.
Yeah.
So all this time, we in the kingdom have been hoarding and saving paper, when if we were in God's money, we would have the ability. And I ask this question, what would you want in your wallet in the end? One that buys you a third of a gallon, or one that buys you 8 gallons? Now, we don't catch this because it's happened over a few decades.
Right.
And I'm a little biased, obviously, because silver is incredibly liquid and it's what we do. But I think people in general in the kingdom, they need to diversify and start diversifying away from paper. Titleless assets. We can't get out of it completely.
Right.
Gold and silver is a big component. Of course, land and other tangibles are components. But start evaluating what you have, because if everything you have is in paper and these events take place, you won't have anything to stand on.
So what's the first step for an individual? They're watching this today and they say, I need to make a change for my family. Things are looking volatile around the world. We're telling them that the economy is hot right now, which means at some point in the future it's not going to be hot.
Right.
So someone watching today, what can they do, Terry?
Well, I think if they want to choose the tangible asset like a silver, I think the most important thing is probably give Cornerstone a call. At least they can have a conversation with someone that can guide them. If you're not going to Cornerstone for it, go somewhere. The point is just Kingdom, get into tangibles. Start looking at your portfolio. Start evaluating what's risky, what's not, what's long-term, what's really short-term risk. Start getting currency and some of those titleless assets out of your way into tangible assets.
Okay.
You could do physical tangible assets like silver sent to your home. You could do private depositories near your house. You could do IRA rollovers into physical silver.
They can do that now?
Absolutely. What they can do when it comes to the physical silver is all you do is fill out the paperwork, which Cornerstone helps with, but fill out the paperwork. You can then transfer funds out of the stock market, purchase physical silver, put into the vault for you, so then no matter what happens, if it really gets ugly, you could actually have that physical silver shipped to your house, worry about taxes later.
Okay.
But it's a way that we can start putting wealth, or at least the control thereof for the future, in our possession and hands. And I think that's very important. It's a slow process because, unfortunately, Doc, they've done a great job psychologically of convincing Americans that silver is ridiculous, that gold is ridiculous. If it was, why are central banks in 2018 buying extraordinary amounts?
Right.
Why are the Chinese constantly doing these exchange for physical deliveries? I really believe it's time now, while the markets are higher, silver's low and oppressed, I call it, buy it now while it's reasonable. Most Americans, Doc, will buy silver eventually because it is our money, it is liquid, and it is tangible. But they'll buy it in the future, probably when it's $30 an ounce. Why not do it now when it's half the price and you gain that 100% profit?
Two questions for you. Why would someone prefer silver over gold?
Mainly two things for me. Gold was made tier one a few years ago. Tier one basically means it's equivalent to currency and U.S. treasuries.
Okay.
Why did they do that? Number one, gold is money, always kind of was money. I'm not so sure I trust gold and the government. I have a feeling because it is tier one again, they could mandate like they did in the 30s, turn in your gold. Remember, gold was just made legal, in the 70s when we came off the standard. So to own anyway, individually.
So how does that make silver a better deal?
Well, silver is industrial. So even though it's our constitutional money, it's industrial. It's like a watch. I mean,
you have to use it in building computers.
Everything.
And stuff,
this whole
right?
entire studio is silver. Our watches, computers, electronics, medical equipment, solar cell systems, everything is silver. So they really can't confiscate silver or mandate that because it's used in industry.
Yes.
The other good news is gold. I still believe in gold, don't get me wrong, but gold going to the high from here is probably about a 40% return. Silver, because of the way it's being oppressed, once gold goes to the high, silver will follow. When silver goes there, it'll be just shy of a 200% return. So if you're trying to protect and preserve an asset, why would you do something that when it goes just to the high is 40% when you can make 200%?
Right.
You could double and triple your money that way in silver. And so silver is an excellent source because we need it industrially. There is no way around it. No other metal does what silver does.
Right.
It's a finite supply, and this is my biggest concern, unfortunately. I had some meetings over this because we're doing some things and we were discussing supply for the future. My refinery is telling me it's not going to be there. We are having serious physical shortages in silver in quantity.
Right.
And he said if Americans stood up and decided to buy physical silver as an alternative, it would be extremely difficult to get.
Wow.
Right now we can. But in the future, he told me, be prepared for 2, possibly 3 months of delays because the source will start to become scarce. And that's concerning.
All right, last question here for you, Terry. Someone's watching or they're listening to the Godcast today and they're saying, money is so confusing. I mean, it's like you have to have an MBA to navigate, you're talking economics and petrodollars, and you're getting me lost, Terry. Is there someone that can help me navigate this and walk me through this?
That's exactly what Cornerstone does. Cornerstone was developed, they are all just like-minded, on-fire Christians. And they were on a mission to get the kingdom to be prepared to educate and understand. And so I think if anything, contacting Cornerstone Asset Metals, they can register on the website, they can give us a call, start talking with a representative and get an understanding of what money is, what's really going on, and they'll guide you through. They'll send information, they'll help guide you. And at the end, Doc, as complicated as money is, if we in the kingdom had always just stayed in things of the earth,
right?
How simple. Now, this is boring. How boring is it to buy silver and gold and stick it on the side? That's what Warren Buffett said. It's just you just take it out of the ground to stick it in the ground. Well, those that have took it out of the ground to stick it in the ground are infinitely wealthier over time because their buying power was maintained.
Right.
And that's a really big deal. So think of how simple that is. You buy the silver, put it away. The only thing to really be aware of, and this is where representatives will walk them through, is just be aware of your timeline, when you need certain monies, how long you would want to invest for certain monies to come due, and then invest accordingly that way. And that's what these representatives typically walk people through.
How can people get in touch with you, Terry?
Well, they go to our website, cornerstoneassetmetals.com. Give us a call at 888-747-3309, and they could talk to a representative directly. They can even follow us. I would say Cornerstone Mint is the coin that we produce. It's your Judeo-Christian silver coin.
Okay.
On Instagram, and I love it because they just do dynamic photos, but they do 1-minute little video clips that kind of do quick educationals. And that seems to be a pretty good following there. We get 20, 30,000 views there. So it seems like there's some interest in that kind of information.
What's your phone number again?
888-747-3309.
Yeah, will they be talking directly to you, or who would they be talking to?
I would love to, but they will talk to a myriad of representatives that are highly skilled and educated. Some of them have been with us for 10 years. It's just really a dynamic, family-knit group. I myself, personally, I do deal with large accounts, mainly because they get complicated when it becomes estates, trusts, inheritances, larger sums. I will help. I'm trying to talk with people, but we definitely will. Someone is there to guide you through it.
And when they call, I can just hear someone saying right now, I'm not going to call. They're just going to try to sell me something.
Well, of course they want to get you, into a tangible asset. That's their real goal. And of course, we produce a Judeo-Christian silver coin that we say is a First Amendment protected. Because it's a religious item, it can't be confiscated, under First Amendment protections. But they're not hard sellers. It's not the goal. At the end of the day, if you want to, go anywhere. Just get the tangible assets. When you talk to our people, you're going to at least get educated. And if you feel comfortable enough, then by all means, we invite the business.
All right.
We donate significantly into the kingdom. That's the mission of Cornerstone as it is anyway. You know how that goes. So that's part of it. So it's not about hard sells at all. It really is just, we want the kingdom to be aware. We want them to be educated on this bigger picture. And if it's us you go through for that supply, well, then we will gladly take it. If not, it's somebody else, just please do it.
Website and phone number again?
CornerstoneAssetMetals.com and 888-747-3309.
It's always a treat having Terry Sacca with us. I always love talking to him. And we could talk here for 3 or 4 hours on this topic easily, but we better not, okay? So thank you, Terry. We appreciate you joining us today. Now, straight ahead, we'll be joined by our political correspondent, Bob Eshelman, as we get the latest updates on what's happening in Iowa as election season ramps up here in 2019. And we'll be finding out just how socialist do you have to be to win the Democrat nomination for president. And we'll talk about the one sleeper candidate making promises of universal basic income. Well, let's take a break with a word from our sponsor, the Holy Bible. Here's Max McLean with a reading from the Word of God.
Listen to the Bible from John chapter 12. Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. But I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. Then Jesus told them, "You are going to have the light just a little while longer. Walk while you have the light, before darkness overtakes you. The man who walks in the dark does not know where he's going. Put your trust in the light while you have it, so that you may become sons of light."
Well, welcome back to True News. We so appreciate Terry Sacca being with us today with Cornerstone Asset Metals, and hope that you share this Godcast today with your friends who are looking for some financial answers in this very troubled economic world. Well, it's been a while since we've had the opportunity to talk to political correspondent Bob Eshelman up in Iowa, and I want to take a little bit of time to do that today because it's hard to believe that in less than 1 year from now, we'll be knee-deep in the political primary season leading up to 2020. Before any of those primaries happen, though, a lot has to happen this year in 2019 leading up to the famous Iowa caucuses. And we have the man on the ground right there, right now, Bob Eshelman. He is our True News political correspondent. We're going to bring him in on the conversation this afternoon. Bob, even though we're going to be knee-deep in primaries a year from now, you've been knee-deep in some white stuff up there, haven't you?
More than knee-deep. It's in a couple of places, it's still even chest-deep.
Well, that's, I know you've been dealing with the cold winter and everything, but you already had a heads up listening to True News. You knew it was going to be cold. So, well, Bob, I want to talk to you a little bit today about the events that are leading up to the Iowa caucuses. Now, a lot of people don't understand what a caucus is. They think it's kind of like a primary, but it's more than that, isn't it?
Yes, the caucus itself is more than just voting for a preference for president. It's where the actual formation of the party platform begins. Local people sit down with people from their own neighborhoods, and they talk about the issues, and they discuss what they'd like the platform to look like, what they'd like to add, what they'd like to take out, that sort of thing. And so that's really where that process begins. Starts with the local precinct caucus, and then you have a district convention, and then you ultimately have a state convention. And that's where the delegates are going to be selected that go to the Republican National Convention or the Democratic National Convention in the fall or early fall.
And how does the candidate selection process take place within the caucus system?
Okay, what's interesting is the Republicans and the Democrats actually have two entirely different systems. At the Republican caucuses, which we had back in 2016, you had all of the candidates on a paper ballot, and people would mark down who their preference was. They'd turn in the ballots, and the ballots would all get counted. Those numbers would get sent to someone in Des Moines, and at a media center at the Republican headquarters, they would announce who the winner was.
Right.
With the Democrats, it's entirely different. With the Democrats, they have this process that's called viability, which is ironic when we're talking about abortion this week. But a candidate is not deemed viable if they don't have a certain percentage of the participants in the precinct caucus. And so sometimes second, third, and with this big of a crowd, we could even be looking at fourth and fifth choices of candidates that people will have to consider in the Democratic caucuses to decide who's actually going to get delegates when it comes time for the final convention.
Well, for all intents and purposes, there's not really going to be a Republican caucus unless there's a major challenger that appears against the president. So the focus of our conversation today is going to be on the Democratic caucus process here. How, it's kind of a wonder to me, Bob, how so many Democratic candidates have entered the field this early in the process. How many official now? Are we looking at about 24 Democratic contenders for the primary prize that have already announced?
We've got, at this point in time, there are 18 candidates who have announced that they are either in the race or they've launched their exploratory committees to investigate whether or not they will be in the race. And most of those that have announced exploratory committees are far more than likely to run. So I would say that we're looking at least 24 candidates by the time we actually start having debates. And my understanding is the first televised debate on CNN will be sometime around April.
Of this year?
Yes.
April of this year. So next month, this is the first day of March, we're talking about having presidential debates within a month?
Yes. Now, typically March is the month where the candidates finally start jumping into the race.
Okay.
But we're 60 days into the calendar year 2019 today. As of today, Democrats have spent 41 days in the state of Iowa.
And has any of the candidates at this point really set themselves out from the pack in any sort of way there in Iowa? Have they, broken out, as we say, from the rest of the race? Or is it pretty much, neck and neck among everyone right now?
I would say it's pretty much what you would expect in a crowded field. Everybody's trying to feel out who these candidates are, where they stand on the issues, and try to figure out, which one's going to best push the issues that they want to see pushed and that sort of thing. And so really there's no real front runner at this point. Although I got to say that if Joe Biden were to jump into the race tomorrow, he would definitely be one of those people that you would say he's near the top of the list, if not at the very top. But there's at least a healthy dozen that I would say any one of them could walk out with a majority of the delegates if the caucus were held today.
Well, Bob, you and I talk a lot about different candidates and everything. We often joke about the candidates that are already in the field now, is about how socialist can you be in order to be the Democratic nominee and still be able to win, get the nomination in Iowa. Iowa is kind of a strange place. I don't mean to knock Iowa in any sense of manner. I just live south in Missouri. But Iowa has a unique atmosphere in this selection process. They're one of the first states to really break the nominees out because you have here a unique set of candidates that really are leaning more toward socialists than anything else, than the middle of the road. How do socialists like, let's say, Bernie Sanders sell themselves in the heartland of Iowa?
Well, you'd be surprised. Iowa, when people hear Iowa, they think cornfields, or they think pigs, or they think farming. But if you do a 35,000-foot flyover of the state, that's probably about all you would see. But for the folks who live here, we understand that almost every issue that's important to people, Iowa plays a very important role in that. For instance, when healthcare and insurance were such a major issue with the Obamacare debate, a lot of people don't realize Des Moines, the capital city, is actually the third largest insurance center in the world.
Really? I didn't know that.
Not the United States, the world.
Wow.
And so, there's a lot more to Iowa than just, growing food and feeding the world. And Iowans take their responsibility of being first in line very, very seriously. And so they will examine these candidates, even on the Democratic side, very extensively. But you mentioned investigating how socialist these candidates are. And I have to say, in a word, it's very. We've analyzed all of the announced candidates at this point on 8 issues, giving each issue a score based on the positions that those candidates have stated either currently or in the near past.
Right.
And the least socialist candidate, and I don't think this would be a surprise to anyone, would be Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii.
Right.
On a scale of 1 to 10, she comes in at a 6.
Right. That's still pretty socialist there.
Yeah.
And at the upper end of the scale, of course, you got Bernie Sanders, who's probably an 11 at least. But in that tier of candidates there that are really, if they stand a chance in Iowa, who are the ones that we really need to be looking at there, just that have declared so far, Bob?
Of the ones that are really standing out right now, you've got, of course, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Right. They appeal to the big-time liberals across the larger metropolitan areas. But you also have Congressman John Delaney, right, who he's actually spent enough time in the state of Iowa that I think he could apply for citizenship. Okay. During the midterm cycle, he actually completed a 99-county tour of the state.
No kidding. Wow.
So he's working on his second lap around the entire state. Senator Kamala Harris is she's getting a lot of name recognition. And then another one that is really standing out for me is this entrepreneur who's in the race. He's not a politician. He's never held political office ever. His name is Andrew Yang. Right. And this is a guy that Christians need to know about, and they need to be worried about.
Well, why is that, Bob? I mean, why does this name stand out among the rest? A lot of people haven't even heard of him. Who is he?
Well, he's led a group. Let me pull this up real quick. He's led a group called Venture America. Right. That they basically provide venture capital to startup companies across the country.
It sounds like a businessman. Sounds like somebody that we could use. A businessman who's a Democrat?
Yeah, a businessman who's a Democrat, who is all in favor of capitalism to a point.
Okay.
And he, however, is also very socialist in how he wants to approach things. And his big pitch to the people of the country is that he wants to put in place UBI, or Universal Basic Income.
Okay. Well, now he's approaching this from a tech perspective and everything, and obviously he sees some things coming, a change taking place in society. He's a believer in the fourth industrial revolution, I take it.
Absolutely. If you have seen his campaign video that's out there, and it's been seen by over 150,000 people already, if you see that video, you would think he's been watching Pastor Rick on the True News Godcast every night, because he's got it down.
Well, I think, Bob, we actually have a clip from his campaign site that kind of explains where his mind is on this process. Let's watch that clip real quick. Here's Andrew Yang, candidate for president on the Democratic side, talking about the fourth industrial revolution.
I'm an entrepreneur and a problem solver who likes math. And I say that because people have told me that the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes math. To tell you all a story in numbers, in part. And I'm going to answer a question that you have been grappling with for the last 2 years, and it may be perhaps the most important question of our time. And that question is this: why did Donald Trump win Iowa by nearly 10 points in 2016? For that matter, why did he win Michigan? Why did he win Ohio? Why did he win Pennsylvania? Why did he win Missouri? Why did he even win Wisconsin? Now that is the question of our time, and the answer is in the numbers. Because again, I love numbers, so I dug in. And the most direct correlation I found was that the more manufacturing jobs were lost in a voting district due to automation, the more blue turned to red in that district. The reason why Donald Trump is our president today is that we've automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Missouri, Wisconsin, and nearly 40,000 right here in Iowa. How many of you personally know someone who has lost his or her job in manufacturing over the last number of years? I'm sure a number of you do. And I've been in these communities in the aftermath of the plant closing. I heard from Mitch right here in Olwine in northeast Iowa what happened there. When jobs disappear, that's when despair takes its place, and that's when blue turns to red. So I have some bad news. I was just in Silicon Valley last month, and this is going to get worse before it gets better. The engineers and scientists of Silicon Valley are working on solving the problems of today, the business problems of today. But as they succeed in solving these problems, their solutions are not going to improve your lives or our lives together. What they're going to do is they're going to make human labor, your labor, our labor, less and less central to the economy and more obsolete. Now this may seem far-fetched or futuristic to some of you, but it's the hard truth. And if you look around you, Iowa has lost 12,000 retail jobs since 2001. How many of you have noticed stores closing in your neighborhoods or area? There are another 178,000 hardworking Iowans in retail and trade right now, and 3 of your 17 malls are in danger of closing. This is going to get worse. There are another over 30,000 Iowans who drive a truck for a living, and this is the most common job in 29 states. My friends in Silicon Valley, and I am friends with some of them, please don't hold against me, but my friends in Silicon Valley are working on trucks that can drive themselves. They say that they're 98% of the way there, and these trucks will start hitting the highways in 5 to 10 years. So the question is, what's going to happen to the drivers at that point? There are thousands of call center workers in Iowa. How many of you saw that Google recently demonstrated software that can do the job of a call center worker? Someone's nodding here. How many of you saw that? Well, you can Google it, and it's there. But these changes are real. Artificial intelligence is real. Autonomous vehicles are real. This is the greatest economic and technological transition in the history of mankind. Donald Trump is the manifestation of this transition. And our government has been decades behind in being honest about it and addressing it. Now, before deciding to run for president, I decided to try and talk to various political leaders about the fact that this is the core set of issues. And what do you think their responses to me were? Go ahead and shout them out. This will be fun. Sorry, go ahead. Wah wah. It sounds like you were in the room. So the solutions I heard were these. 1, we cannot talk about that. 2, we should study that further. And 3, we must educate and retrain Americans for the jobs of the future. Now that third one sounds great. I'm a Democrat, I love education, I love retraining. But again, I looked at the numbers. And we know what happens in the aftermath of losing these manufacturing jobs, that only less than 10% of manufacturing workers qualified for federally funded retraining programs, and if they did participate, the success rate was less than 20%. We know that almost half of manufacturing workers that lost their jobs left the workforce and did not work again, and that nearly a quarter of manufacturing jobs that lost their jobs left the workforce and never worked again. So those are the numbers. That is the story the numbers are telling us. And this is the challenge of our era.
Well, I got to tell you, Bob, his pitch there is actually kind of appealing, except for his digs at President Trump. I mean, he's really laying out the case that we're getting ready to go through a transformation in society, and we're woefully unprepared for that. Like you said, it sounds like it was lifted from True News. But in the process of him presenting himself as a viable candidate out there, one solution that he's offering is the concept of universal basic income. Now, in my opinion, UBI goes against human nature itself, but he seems to have the idea in his head that this could work. You want to help set up this next clip, Bob?
Yeah, he's about to start talking about his 3-point plan for fixing what he's correctly pointed out is going to be a major problem for government going forward as we move through the fourth industrial revolution. The other two pieces are being universal health care or Medicare for all.
Right.
And the other being he wants to eliminate the use of GDP as a metric for measuring the American national well-being. Instead, he'd rather use what he calls the American scorecard, which is going to create a whole new range of metrics that are based on a number of environmental and social justice issues.
Okay.
But really, his big pitch is this UBI program. And when you hear what he wants to do, and the fact that he really has a way to do it, I think this should be scaring a lot of people.
Well, let's watch this clip. Here's Andrew Yang making his pitch for universal basic income as he runs for president of the United States.
We must fundamentally shift the way we perceive work and value in our society. And I have a 3-part plan to make this happen and solve for the greatest issue that threatens our way of life today. Now, the first is the freedom dividend, where every American adult would receive $1,000 free and clear, no questions asked, every month to pay your bills, invest in your families, start new businesses, and do what you want to do because you know how best you would use that money. Already right now, 31% of Iowans are working full-time and cannot make ends meet, and 59% of our fellow Americans cannot pay an unexpected $500 bill. They are living paycheck to paycheck, week to week, and you know that is the reality for many of your friends and neighbors. And we can change that. We can give Americans a raise. So many of you might think, wow, that sounds phenomenal, too good to be true, but I want to give you some background and history. A law almost exactly like this passed the House of Representatives in 1971 under Richard Nixon. Martin Luther King was for it. 1,000 economists signed a letter saying this would be great for the economy and society. And a plan just like this has been in effect in one state for 36 years, where it has created thousands of jobs, helped improve children's nutrition, and lowered income inequality. And what state is that? You may or may not know. Yeah, it's Alaska. And they use oil money. And I'm going to ask you all today, Democrats of Iowa, what is the oil of today? Technology. That's right. That is the oil of today. So my plan, the Freedom Dividend, would put $16 billion into the hands of Iowans every year so that you could pay your bills and do everything that you would do with $1,000 more per month, and it would create over 40,000 jobs in Iowa immediately. Now, this is a very, very big plan and a big move, but it's something that we can achieve because, again, you determine the future of this country, and we need to build an economy that actually puts human goals and values front and center, invest in our people, and build a trickle-up economy. The Republicans have been selling that trickle-down garbage for decades, and we know it doesn't work at all. They even know it doesn't work. They know it's nonsense. So we're going to build a trickle-up economy from our people up, our families up, and our communities up, and that's the first big move I'll make as president.
Well, Bob, don't you want a freedom dividend? Don't you want one?
Who wouldn't want free money, right? The
That's
problem
right.
is it's not free money. It came from somebody, and it was taken by force.
Yeah, I wonder where they came up with the $1,000 number. Why not 5,000? Why not 10,000? Why not give everybody $1 million, Bob? I mean, it's just money, right?
Right. Money just grows on trees, apparently.
So we may as well throw in the free cheese and the free beans and everything else along with that. So, well, Bob, we appreciate you checking in with us today, and I want you to stay on top of this with Andrew Yang and keep following him and, of course, all the candidates there in Iowa. And there's going to be a lot of things that will be happening. And next month, remember, is the first debate. Can you believe it? The first presidential debate of this election cycle. And Bob, we're going to have to make arrangements somehow to get a crew up there and have you together with us and maybe even to cover that debate, because that's going to be the first, that's going to be the starting gun for the whole cycle. Any final thoughts, Bob?
No, I would like to just make one small point about the Iowa caucuses again, and that is that even though there isn't going to probably be a primary race for President Trump, the process for setting the platform for putting forward the issues that we need to have advanced in Washington, D.C. starts with the caucuses. Okay. And we really need people to be praying about that, to be praying over it, and to be praying that only issues that are going to help advance the kingdom would prevail in that process.
All right. Well, that's True News political correspondent Bob Eshman checking in from the cold north frontier of Iowa. Well, it's a brand new month. Today's the first day of March, and a brand new day to make a commitment to the ministry and outreach of True News. Give us a call, write us, email us, or visit the website or app and let us know how much you appreciate True News. Here's our contact information. Our phone number is 800-576-2116. That's 800-576-2116. You can also write us at True News, P.O. Box 690069, Vero Beach, Florida 32969. But as always, it's the easiest way to get in touch with us and show us your love and show us your support is to either visit the website at truenews.com or go to the App Store and download our app for both Android and for Apple devices. That's the easiest way to connect with us. And when you go to the website and when you go to the app, you're going to see up in the upper left-hand corner, just like you see on your screen right now, our heart button. You touch our heart, that's touching our heart. And it goes to our donate page, and you can show your love for us by your monthly faithful commitment and support of this ministry. By the way, if you find yourself in Florida on a Sunday evening, we'd like to extend an invitation to you to join us for worship. Flowing Streams Church meets at 6 p.m. Sunday evenings to lift up prayer and praise and to hear from the Word of God. Our address is 2355 82nd Avenue in Vero Beach, Florida. Now from Interstate 95, take exit 147 for 1.5 miles to the east to 82nd Avenue. Then make a left and we are 2 blocks down on the left. And for more information about our services, just search Flowing Streams Church on Facebook. There you can get directions, contact information, and even listen to previous church services. And we hope that you can make it this coming Sunday evening. We'd like to thank Terry Saka of Cornerstone Asset Metals for joining us today and for providing his insight on this edition of the Godcast, and for True News political correspondent Bob Eshman checking in from the cold political frontier of Iowa. On behalf of our True News team of Kerry Kinsey and Edward Zoll, traveling back from Hanoi, Vietnam for the President's North Korean Summit this week, and for our team of Rick Wiles, Paul Benson, and Max Gow, making their journey from Barcelona, Spain at this year's Mobile World Congress, I'm Doc Burkhart. Thank you for watching this edition of True News. God bless you.